For centuries, historians have studied royal family trees using ink and paper, but when researchers fed the bloodlines of Europe's most powerful monarchs into advanced artificial intelligence, they discovered 598 hidden genetic connections that had been invisible to the human eye. What they found would completely reshape how we understand the inheritance of power across centuries. When you look at a traditional family tree, it appears as a simple chart of lines and boxes. Parents connect to children, siblings branch out horizontally, marriages are marked with connecting lines. It seems straightforward. But what if I told you that what you're seeing is only a fraction of the actual story? What if the real connections between the world's most powerful monarchs are far more intricate, far more influential, and far more surprising than any genealogy book has ever revealed? This is the question that captivated researchers at the University of Messina in Italy recently. They took one of the most famous royal families in history, the House of Saxe, Coburg, and Gotha, which became the House of Windsor, and analyzed it using cutting-edge artificial intelligence. What they discovered was not just another historical footnote, it was a fundamental reshaping of how we understand power, genetics, and the hidden architecture of European monarchy. The research began with a simple premise, yet it led to extraordinary discoveries. Scientists understood that traditional genealogical analysis had significant limitations. When you trace a family tree by hand, or even using conventional databases, you are primarily recording direct relationships. Who married whom? Who had children with whom? How those children dispersed across Europe and married into other royal families. But there is an invisible layer underneath these obvious connections. There are genetic relationships that exist through multiple paths, indirect inheritances of traits and influence that echo across generations, hidden pathways of connection that only became visible when researchers applied machine learning and graph database analysis. The team at the University of Messina, led by researchers including Rosario Napoli, Antonio Celesti, Massimo Villari, and Maria Fazio, decided to tackle this problem head-on. They created what is known as a knowledge graph, essentially a sophisticated map, where each royal family member is a node, and each connection between them is a weighted edge that can carry information about genetic relationships, degrees of separation, and inherited characteristics. Then they applied a technique called knowledge completion, which is designed to reveal implicit relationships that exist but are not explicitly recorded in standard databases. The scale of their discovery was remarkable. When they analyzed the royal family using traditional methods, the database contained what seemed like a fairly comprehensive family tree with direct connections mapped out. But when they applied their knowledge completion algorithm using something called scalable transitive relationships, which essentially means following the logical chains of heredity through multiple generations, they added 598 previously hidden relationships to the graph, nearly 600 new connections that had existed all along but remained invisible to conventional analysis. To understand why this matters, imagine trying to understand the power structure of a company by only looking at direct reporting relationships. You might see that Bob reports to Sarah and Sarah reports to the CEO. But what if you are missing the fact that Bob is married to the CEO's sister, that his college roommate is the CFO, that his mother was the founder's personal advisor? The web of influence becomes infinitely more complex and more significant than the org chart suggests. The same principle applies to royal families, except instead of professional relationships and marriages, you are tracking genetics, bloodlines, and hereditary claims to power. Now, here's where the research becomes truly fascinating. Once they had mapped all these hidden connections, the researchers applied what are called centrality measures. These are mathematical tools that calculate how important each node is within a network. The most prominent of these is called degree centrality, which simply counts how many connections each person has, and PageRank, which measures not just the number of connections, but also the quality and importance of those connections. When they looked at the results for Queen Victoria, they discovered something remarkable. Before applying knowledge completion, Victoria had a certain degree centrality score, a measure of how genetically central she was to the royal family. But after revealing the hidden relationships, her degree centrality increased by 6,000%. 6,000%. Think about that number for a moment. It means that once you account for all the genetic pathways through which Victoria's influence flows across the family, her importance is literally 60 times greater than what traditional genealogical analysis would suggest. Prince Albert of Saxe-Coburg-Gotha showed similarly striking numbers. His degree centrality jumped from 9.0 to 112.0, an increase of over 1,100%. These were not just abstract statistical changes. They represented the revelation of Victoria and Albert as perhaps the most genetically prolific ancestors in all of European royal history. But the story of their influence goes far deeper than mere numbers. To understand the real significance of these findings, we need to step back and look at who Victoria and Albert actually were and what they did. Victoria married her first cousin, Prince Albert, in February of 1840 at the Chapel Royal of St. James's Palace in London. This was not an arranged marriage in the cold, political sense that many royal unions were. By accounts of the time, it was a love match. Victoria and Albert genuinely cared for one another, and their personal relationship was warm and affectionate. Yet it was also undeniably political. Albert came from the house of Saxe-Coburg-Saalfeld, a German duchy that was deeply connected to Europe's ruling families. Victoria's own mother was Princess Victoria of Saxe-Coburg-Saalfeld. This marriage, therefore, was not just the union of two individuals. It was the merging of the British royal line with one of the most influential German principalities. Together, Victoria and Albert had 9 children. This is crucial to understanding the research findings. Through these 9 children, they created pathways of connection that would spread across the entire continent. Their children married into the royal families of Denmark, Norway, Spain, Sweden, Germany, Russia, Romania, and Greece. They had an incredible reach. But it was not just about how many children they had. It was about the strategic brilliance of their marriages. These were not random unions. Each marriage was crafted to strengthen alliances, to secure British interests, and to extend the reach of British influence across Europe. Victoria would later earn the nickname the Grandmother of Europe, and this title was not merely sentimental, it was literal. Her grandchildren sat upon the thrones of multiple European nations. Now, here's where the research becomes particularly interesting and particularly dark, because along with power and prestige, Victoria and Albert also inherited and transmitted genetic conditions. One of the most significant of these was hemophilia, a blood clotting disorder. Victoria was a carrier of this condition. Some of her daughters were also carriers. Her son Leopold suffered from hemophilia directly. Through the marriages they arranged, Victoria and Albert's daughters and granddaughters transmitted hemophilia into the royal families of Spain, Russia, Germany, and other nations. This genetic inheritance tells us something profound about what the research really means. When the researchers calculated that Queen Victoria's genetic significance had increased by 6,000% once you account for all hidden relationships, they were not just talking about abstract genealogical connections. They were talking about real, tangible impacts on the genetics of entire nations. They were talking about a gene for hemophilia that could be traced through every major European monarchy. They were talking about a woman whose biological legacy literally flowed through the veins of rulers who would shape the history of the 20th century. The research team specifically applied a mathematical model to understand how genetic material degrades over generations. They used what is called a decay function, essentially a mathematical formula that says your genetic influence on distant relatives becomes weaker the further you get from them in the family tree. The specific formula they employed was EFD equals 1/2 to the power of D, which means that with each generation that passes, the genetic contribution drops by half. After 7 generations, the shared DNA becomes negligible. This is actually biologically accurate, which is why the researchers chose this particular formula. But here's the crucial part. Even as genetic influence decays with each generation, the sheer number of pathways through which genes travel through a family tree means that someone as prolific as Queen Victoria still maintains an enormous genetic footprint across the entire dynasty. It is not just about direct descendants. It is about all the interconnected branches, all the cousins marrying cousins, all the genetic material flowing through multiple channels simultaneously. The researchers applied their analysis to 2 different data sets to test their methodology. The first was the administrative structure of the Roman Empire under Diocletian, which had a clear hierarchical chain of command. This served as a proof of concept. They could show that when you add hidden indirect authority relationships, you get dramatically different measures of who actually held power. The emperor's centrality increased by 1,000% when you account for indirect authority that flows through the hierarchy. But the second data set was where their work really shone, the genealogical tree of the UK royal family. The analysis here was not just academic, it had real historical implications. When researchers study family trees, they typically use tools that capture explicit relationships. Person A married person B had children with person C. Those children married into family D. Each relationship is recorded once, and the tree grows from there. But what knowledge completion does is reveal the implicit relationships that emerge from these explicit ones. If you are a second cousin to someone, you are not just related through a direct line, you are related through multiple pathways. You might share great-great-grandparents through your mother's line and also through your father's line through a different branch entirely. The algorithm revealed patterns that human genealogists might miss or might not think to highlight. For instance, 2 people who appear to be distant cousins in a traditional family tree might actually be connected through 4 or 5 different pathways of descent. Each pathway represents a separate channel through which genetic material flows, a separate line of influence. Once the researchers had mapped all these connections, they looked at individuals other than Victoria and Albert. They examined what happened to various royal family members when you account for all hidden relationships. Flora Vesterberg experienced a 20% increase in her PageRank score. Alexander Ogilvy saw similar gains. These increases might sound small compared to Victoria's 6,000%, but they tell important stories about who held influence in the royal network. PageRank is particularly interesting as a metric because it does not just count connections, it weights them. A connection to someone who is themselves highly connected counts for more than a connection to someone who is less influential. It is the same algorithm that Google uses to rank websites. A page that is linked to by many important pages is itself considered important. Applied to a royal family, it reveals whose genetic inheritance and social position gave them the most significance within the network. What the researchers found was that the traditional understanding of royal importance, based on who sat on thrones and who held official titles, was actually incomplete. There were individuals whose genetic and social centrality within the network was much greater than their public prominence would suggest. And conversely, there were some traditionally celebrated monarchs whose actual centrality was less than expected. This has profound implications for how we understand history. When we study European politics in the 19th and 20th centuries, we tend to focus on crowned heads of state. King this, emperor that, queen the other. But if we understood the actual genetic and social centrality of various royal family members, would we tell history differently? Would we focus on different people? Would we see different patterns of alliance and conflict? The research also revealed something about genetic drift and concentration. Because royal families intermarried so extensively, especially with their own cousins, genetic material from certain lineages became highly concentrated. Victoria's and Albert's genes did not just spread widely across Europe. They amplified. They concentrated. The genetic pool among European royalty actually became smaller and more interrelated over time, not larger and more diverse. This is why hemophilia, a relatively rare genetic condition in the general population, became a recurring problem among royal families. The same genes kept recombining in the same limited pool of people. This brings us to a broader reflection on what this research really tells us. It is not just about history. It is about understanding networks, understanding how influence flows through systems, understanding how centrality works in complex human societies. For centuries, we studied genealogy as if it were simply a matter of tracing bloodlines. You are descended from this person and that person, therefore you have a claim to property, status, or power. It is linear. It is clear. It is simple. But the research from University of Messina shows us that genealogy is actually a network. It is multidimensional. It is something that only becomes fully visible when you have the mathematical tools to analyze it properly. There are practical applications for this kind of analysis too. Genealogists can use these techniques to understand hereditary diseases better. If you are studying a condition like hemophilia that runs in families, you need to understand not just who is directly descended from a carrier, but all the pathways through which the condition could have entered the family tree. You need to account for hidden relationships. You need knowledge completion. Medical researchers studying genetic predispositions to disease can use similar methodologies. If you are trying to understand why a certain condition is prevalent in a particular population, you need to understand the network of genetic relationships that person belongs to, not just their direct lineage. The research also has implications for understanding social networks more broadly. Royal families are, in many ways, just networks of people connected by relationships. The same techniques that reveal hidden connections in royal families could reveal hidden connections in other networks. Corporate hierarchies, academic institutions, even social media networks, all of these can be analyzed using similar graph database techniques. The team specifically noted that their approach introduces what they call scalable transitive relationships. What this means in practical terms is that they do not just say Victoria is connected to everyone she married and had children with. They recognize that her influence echoes forward through generations with gradually diminishing strength. Her great-great-great-grandchild carries only 1/32 of her genes, but they are still her genes. They still carry her genetic legacy. This concept of scalable transitive relationships is actually quite elegant mathematically. Rather than treating genetic inheritance as a binary thing, you either share genes or you do not. It treats inheritance as something that has degrees, strengths, and attenuation. The further you get from the original source, the weaker the signal. But even a weak signal repeated across enough different pathways adds up to something significant. The researchers specifically designed a decay function appropriate to biological inheritance. In genetics, the relationship between parent and child is clear. They share approximately 50% of their DNA. The relationship between grandparent and grandchild is approximately 25%. Great-grandparent to great-grandchild is approximately 12.5%. By the 7th generation, the percentage becomes negligible. This biological reality was built into their mathematical model. What this means is that when the researchers say Queen Victoria's centrality increased by 6,000%, this is not just a mathematical artifact. It is not just a consequence of running an algorithm. It reflects a biological reality. Victoria was, in fact, more central to the genetic makeup of European royal families than anyone had quantified before. She was, in the most literal sense, the most prolific ancestor in the network. Looking at the broader context, there are currently 29 monarchs in the world today. The British monarchy still commands enormous global attention, but there are wealthier royal families in the Middle East, more powerful ones in East Asia, and others distributed across Africa and the Pacific. Each of these royal families has its own complex genealogical networks, its own patterns of intermarriage and alliance. If researchers applied the same knowledge completion techniques to other royal families, what would they discover? Would the Saudi royal family reveal similar patterns of genetic concentration? Would the Thai monarchy? Would the Japanese imperial family, which traces its lineage back over 1,000 years? The research from the University of Messina opens up these questions and provides a methodology for answering them. The implications extend beyond genealogy and genetics. The research demonstrates the power of what is called knowledge graphs and graph machine learning. These are techniques that are increasingly being used in artificial intelligence and data science to understand complex, interconnected data. They are used in recommendation engines to find products you might like based on complex networks of similarity and connection. They are used in fraud detection to find suspicious patterns in financial networks. They are used in drug discovery to understand how different chemicals interact with biological systems. The specific platform the researchers used was Neo4j, which is one of the most widely adopted graph databases in the world. Companies like Facebook, LinkedIn, and Amazon use similar technologies to manage their enormous networks of connected data. The research from Messina demonstrates that these same techniques can be applied to historical and genealogical data to reveal patterns that would be impossible to see through traditional means. There is also something philosophically interesting about what this research reveals. For a long time, history was written as a narrative of individual actors. Great men and women shaped history through their decisions, their ambitions, their genius. But modern network analysis suggests that history is also shaped by structure, by where you sit in the network, by how many connections you have, by how close you are to centers of power and influence. Queen Victoria did not consciously set out to become the most genetically central person in European royal history. She had children because she loved her husband and because that is what was expected of her. But the structure of royal marriage and royal inheritance meant that her actions, the simple biological act of having 9 children and arranging their marriages strategically, created a network topology that would echo through generations. She became central not because she was uniquely brilliant or unusually ambitious, but because of structural factors in how royal marriage worked. This raises interesting questions about agency and determinism in history. How much of historical outcome is determined by individual choice, and how much is determined by the structure of the systems people operate within? The research does not answer this question, but it makes the question more precise. It gives us tools to measure structural centrality, to quantify the role of networks in shaping history. As we look toward the future, this research has clear potential to expand. The University of Messina team published their methodology for other researchers. They plan to expand analysis to other royal families and integrate graph neural networks, AI systems designed for network data. Imagine the possibilities. Researchers could map the genealogies of major historical figures across centuries and continents. They could reveal the hidden networks that connected philosophers, scientists, artists, and political leaders. They could show how ideas and innovations spread through networks of personal connection as much as through formal institutions. They could demonstrate that the great intellectual movements of history did not emerge randomly, but were shaped by the network structure of the people involved. For medical researchers, the applications are immediately practical. Hereditary diseases could be analyzed through the lens of complete network knowledge. Genetic counselors could use this methodology to give more accurate risk assessments. Population geneticists could understand better how rare genetic variants spread through populations. For historians, the research offers a new lens through which to view the past. Traditional history is written in narrative form. This happened, then that happened, then because of that, this other thing happened. But network analysis reveals simultaneity and pattern. Multiple things happen at the same time because they are connected through the network structure. Patterns repeat because network structures tend to repeat. The research from the University of Messina ultimately tells us something profound. The visible world, the thrones and crowns and official titles, is just the surface of a much deeper, more complex reality. Underneath the visible hierarchy is a hidden architecture of connection and influence. Only by revealing these hidden structures, only by completing our knowledge of networks and relationships, can we truly understand how power flows, how influence spreads, and how individual lives ripple outward to shape history. Think about the practical implications of this research in modern times. Today, we live in an era of massive data collection and surveillance. Our phones track our location, our computers track our browsing habits, our social media accounts generate enormous databases of our connections and behaviors. With this unprecedented data about human networks, we have the tools to understand social structures at scales and in ways that would have been unimaginable just a few decades ago. Yet most of this analysis remains focused on the present moment. We use network analysis to sell products, to manipulate behavior, to optimize systems for profit. But this research from University of Messina suggests there is another use for these tools. We can turn them toward the past. We can use artificial intelligence and graph databases to better understand history. We can reveal patterns that have been hidden for centuries. Moreover, this kind of analysis is not limited to royal families or even to historical figures. The techniques can be applied to any population where genealogical data exists. Genetic researchers studying human migration patterns could use these methods to understand how populations spread across continents. Epidemiologists studying disease spread could understand how pathogens move through networks of human contact. Sociologists studying social mobility could understand how opportunity and advantage flow through networks of connection. The fundamental insight is this: many phenomena that seem random or mysterious at first actually follow from the structure of the networks in which people are embedded. The structure is not always obvious, it is often hidden, but mathematical tools like those used by the Messina researchers can reveal it. Queen Victoria died in 1901. Prince Albert died in 1861, 40 years before Victoria. Neither of them could have imagined that their family tree would one day be analyzed by mathematical algorithms running on computers. They could never have predicted that researchers in Italy would use artificial intelligence to quantify their genetic significance as multiples of thousands of percent. Yet here we are in the 21st century with tools powerful enough to reveal the true extent of their influence across generations and continents. And that is perhaps the most important lesson of all. History is not fixed. It is not locked in the books written by previous generations. Each time we develop new tools, new methodologies, new ways of analyzing the past, history reveals new dimensions. The research on royal family networks is not just about the past. It is about understanding that the future of historical knowledge is tied to our ability to process complex, interconnected data. The monarchs of Europe have already passed into history, but their networks live on, encoded in databases, waiting to be analyzed, waiting to reveal their secrets to anyone with the tools to ask the right questions. The work of Rosario Napoli, Antonio Celesti, Massimo Villari, and Maria Fazio at the University of Messina represents a frontier in how we understand the past. It combines traditional historical research with cutting-edge artificial intelligence. It takes genealogical data that has been collected and preserved for centuries and subjects it to mathematical analysis that reveals patterns no human genealogist could ever discover by reading trees manually. This is the power of combining domain expertise with computational methods. The researchers knew genealogy. They understood historical records. They knew how royal families worked. But they also understood machine learning, graph theory, and network analysis. By bringing these different forms of knowledge together, they created something new. They created a new way of seeing the past. And as technology continues to advance, as computers become more powerful, as artificial intelligence becomes more sophisticated, we can expect to see many more discoveries like this. Historians will use machine learning to identify patterns in historical texts. Network scientists will map the connections between historical figures. Genetic researchers will use these same techniques to understand how traits and diseases spread through populations. The story of Queen Victoria and Prince Albert, as revealed through this research, is ultimately a story about the power of networks. It is a story about how structure determines destiny. It is a story about how visibility changes when you have the right tools to see. And it is a story that will continue to unfold as researchers apply these techniques to other areas of history, other populations, other networks. This is the future of historical research. This is how we will understand the past, not through narrative alone, not through the reading of individual documents and memoirs, but through the mathematical analysis of the networks that shaped human societies. The research from University of Messina is just the beginning. The full power of these remarkable techniques is yet to be realized. Consider what happened in the immediate aftermath of this research. Genealogists around the world took notice. Museums began examining their archives with fresh eyes. Academic historians started collaborating with computer scientists in new ways. A new field was emerging at the intersection of history and data science. The implications for our understanding of causation in history are profound. We often say that historical events were caused by specific factors. War broke out because of conflicting interests. A scientific breakthrough happened because of genius. Political movements gained traction because of charismatic leaders. But through network analysis, you see something different. People were embedded in specific network structures. Those structures made certain outcomes more likely than others. Individual agency still matters, but it is always exercised within context. The context is the network. Understanding the network gives insight into why some individuals had impact they did, and why others, despite talents, had less influence. This research opens doors to understanding not just European royalty, but the global history of power. The Ottomans had complex dynastic structures. Chinese imperial families intermarried strategically. Indian kingdoms formed alliances through marriage. African kingdoms had genealogical systems. Every society has networks of kinship and power.